Thousands of gardeners lose entire harvests every single season without ever realizing the real problem was never the weather, the seeds, or bad luck. The real problem was planting the wrong vegetable in the wrong place, specifically putting certain crops straight into garden beds when those same vegetables actually perform better, healthier, and more productively inside a simple container. By the end of this video, the vegetables that genuinely prefer pots over garden beds will be laid out clearly, along with the exact reasons containers outperform traditional beds for each one, the mistakes that quietly ruin harvests, and which of these crops beginners should start with immediately if bigger, cleaner harvests are the goal this season. This matters right now more than almost any other time of year. Grocery prices keep climbing. Native soil across huge parts of the country is either clay, rocky, or compacted from years of foot traffic, and late summer heat is putting stress on anything still sitting in the ground. HOA restrictions, apartment leases, and tiny patios have pushed a lot of people out of traditional gardening entirely, and containers quietly solve every one of those problems at once. More American gardeners are quietly switching to containers, not because they lack space, but because containers hand back control over soil quality, watering, pest pressure, and productivity that a traditional bed simply cannot offer in the same way. Root temperature, oxygen availability at the root zone, drainage speed, and even how quickly disease spreads from one plant to the next are all things a gardener can actually manage in a container, while a garden bed mostly just hands you whatever soil happened to be there already. One vegetable on this list consistently produces cleaner, healthier harvests in a container than it ever does in a garden bed, almost every single time. Another surprises even experienced gardeners, because it grows faster in a pot than in nearly any other setup available. Both are coming, but they are worth waiting for, and everything in between will likely change how at least one corner of a patio, deck, or balcony gets used for the rest of the season. Picture a small deck lined with a handful of mismatched containers, tomatoes climbing a stake in one corner, peppers glowing red and green in another, a shallow tray of lettuce staying tender in the shade nearby. That is the kind of compact, productive kitchen garden this list is about to build, one vegetable at a time. Vegetable number 1 is the tomato, specifically compact determinate and patio varieties bred to thrive in confined root space. Tomatoes grown directly in the ground are constantly exposed to soil-borne diseases, like blight and wilt, that live in the earth year after year and splash up onto lower leaves with every rainfall. Move that same tomato into a container filled with fresh, sterile potting mix, and that entire disease cycle gets broken before it starts. A 5-gallon container is the practical minimum, though a 7 to 10-gallon pot produces noticeably stronger plants and heavier fruit sets. Use a well-draining potting mix blended with compost rather than heavy garden soil, which compacts inside a container and suffocates roots by cutting off the oxygen that root hairs need to actually absorb water and nutrients. Water deeply whenever the top inch of soil feels dry, aiming for consistency rather than frequency, since irregular watering is what causes cracked fruit and blossom end rot. Tomatoes need a minimum of 6 hours of direct sun and a balanced fertilizer every 2 to 3 weeks, once flowering begins, keeps production steady. Picture a sunny wooden deck lined with a few of these pots, vines heavy with ripening fruit, and not a single tomato hornworm in sight, because the container was filled with fresh mix instead of soil that's hosted pests for years. Basil planted alongside is a classic companion that many gardeners swear improves flavor and helps repel certain pests. The most common mistake is choosing an indeterminate, sprawling variety for a small pot, which quickly outgrows its space and topples over in the first strong summer wind. Expect first ripe fruit around 70 to 80 days from transplant, and container growing shortens that timeline slightly because the soil warms faster than ground soil does. Look for varieties like Patio Princess, Bush Early Girl, or Tiny Tim for the most reliable container performance. But this next vegetable completely changed the way many gardeners think about small spaces. Vegetable number 2 is the pepper, and this is where container gardening genuinely starts to outperform the ground. Peppers are heat lovers, and containers warm up faster than garden soil, giving pepper roots the elevated temperature they actually crave for strong fruit production. Root confinement also triggers peppers into putting more energy toward fruiting rather than excessive leafy growth, something ground-planted peppers rarely experience. A 3 to 5 gallon dark-colored container works well, since dark containers absorb extra heat that peppers appreciate, essentially acting like a small greenhouse around the root zone even on a cooler morning. Use a loose, well-draining mix with added perlite for airflow and water when the top inch dries out, being careful never to let peppers sit in standing water. Full sun is essential, at least 6 to 8 hours daily. Feed with a phosphorus-rich fertilizer every 3 weeks, once flowers appear to support fruit development over foliage. Marigolds planted nearby help deter aphids naturally. The common mistake is overwatering out of habit, which peppers tolerate far worse than underwatering, since soggy roots struggle to breathe and flowers drop before ever setting fruit. Harvest typically begins 60 to 90 days after transplant, depending on variety, and container heat retention often pushes that timeline earlier than in-ground plantings. Varieties like cayenne, jalapeno, and compact bell types such as mohawk perform exceptionally well in pots, rewarding even a small balcony with a surprisingly heavy harvest by late summer. And this is where container gardening really starts to outperform traditional beds in a way most people never expect. Vegetable number 3 is the potato, which sounds unusual until the mechanics are explained. Potatoes grown in the ground are vulnerable to wireworms, voles, and rot from heavy clay soil that traps moisture around developing tubers. In a container, drainage is controlled entirely by the gardener. Pests have a far harder time reaching the crop, and harvesting means simply dumping out the container instead of digging blindly through the earth and slicing tubers apart with a shovel. A 10 to 15 gallon grow bag or barrel works best, filled gradually as the plant grows, a technique called hilling that dramatically increases yield by giving the stem more buried surface area to sprout additional tubers along its length. Use a loose, rich mix of potting soil and compost. Water consistently, keeping soil moist but never soggy, since potatoes rot quickly in waterlogged conditions, and the smell of a ruined batch of tubers is not something any gardener wants to discover in August. 6 or more hours of sun is ideal. Fertilize with a potassium-rich feed every few weeks to support tuber development. Potatoes pair well planted near beans, which help fix nitrogen into the soil. The biggest mistake is planting too shallow and never hilling, which leads to green, inedible tubers exposed to sunlight. Expect harvest around 70 to 100 days depending on variety, with early types like Yukon Gold performing beautifully in containers, and the payoff of simply tipping over a grow bag onto a tarp to reveal a pile of clean potatoes is one of the most satisfying moments in container gardening. Most gardeners never realize this until they lose an entire season to something completely avoidable. Vegetable number 4 is lettuce and leafy salad greens, which struggle in ground beds against relentless weed competition and unpredictable soil moisture. In a container, weeds are virtually eliminated, and the shallow root systems these greens rely on stay consistently moist without competing against deep-rooted weeds stealing water and nutrients nearby. A shallow container, only 6 to 8 inches deep, is plenty, since greens have minimal root depth requirements, which makes them perfect for gardeners working with nothing more than a windowsill box or a narrow balcony rail planter. Use a light, moisture-retentive potting mix. Water frequently, since shallow containers dry out faster than deep ones, checking daily during warm weather. Greens tolerate partial shade and only need 4 to 6 hours of sun, making them ideal for gardeners without a full sun yard. A light nitrogen feed every couple of weeks keeps leaves tender and productive. Chives planted at the edge of the container help deter pests naturally. The common mistake is overcrowding seeds, which leads to weak, leggy plants competing for light instead of the compact, full heads gardeners actually picture in their minds. Harvest begins in just 30 to 45 days, and successive small plantings every couple of weeks keep a steady supply coming right up until the first hard frost. Varieties like black-seeded Simmons, Buttercrunch, and mixed mesclun blends thrive in containers. This next vegetable benefits from something containers naturally provide that garden beds simply cannot replicate. Vegetable number 5 is the bush variety green bean, which avoids the fungal pressure that climbing beans face when leaves stay damp and crowded in a garden row. Containers improve airflow around the plant, drastically cutting down on the powdery mildew and rust that plague beans planted too close together in traditional rows. A 5-gallon container comfortably supports several bush bean plants. Use a well-draining mix and water at the base rather than overhead to keep foliage dry and disease-free, since damp leaves sitting in humid air overnight are exactly what fungal spores need to take hold. Beans need 6 or more hours of sun daily. A light, balanced fertilizer at planting is usually enough, since beans fix their own nitrogen as they grow through a natural relationship with soil bacteria. Beans and carrots make excellent container companions when space allows. The common mistake is watering directly onto the leaves, which invites fungal problems almost immediately. Harvest arrives around 50 to 60 days from planting, and picking consistently encourages the plant to keep producing rather than shutting down once a few pods mature and go unpicked. Bush varieties like Provider and Blue Lake Bush perform reliably in containers season after season. Wait until you see what happens when this next crop is grown in a simple container instead of a crowded garden row. Vegetable number 6 is the cucumber, specifically compact or bush varieties bred for small spaces. Ground-grown cucumbers sprawling across damp soil are a magnet for powdery mildew, since leaves stay pressed against moist earth with almost no airflow. Elevated in a container, especially trained up a small trellis, cucumber leaves dry quickly after watering or rainfall, cutting disease pressure dramatically. A 5-gallon container paired with a vertical trellis works beautifully, and there is something deeply satisfying about watching cucumber vines climb a simple trellis on a patio rather than sprawling across a muddy garden bed. Use a rich, well-draining mix and water deeply and consistently, since cucumbers are notoriously sensitive to inconsistent moisture, which causes bitter fruit. Full sun, at least 6 hours, is required. Feed every 2 to 3 weeks with a balanced fertilizer once vines begin climbing. Nasturtiums planted nearby help lure aphids away from the main crop. The common mistake is letting vines sprawl across the ground even in a container setup, undoing the airflow benefit entirely and putting the plant right back into the humid, disease-prone conditions containers were supposed to solve. Expect harvest around 50 to 70 days, with bush varieties like Bush Champion and Salad Bush offering excellent container performance. What's surprising is that some vegetables actually produce fewer diseases and larger harvests once they're moved out of the garden and into containers, and that pattern keeps repeating itself throughout this entire list. If you're still watching, and Small Space Grower is not yet in your subscription list, understand what that actually means. YouTube tracks the channels you follow and prioritizes your content in your feed. The moment you leave this video without subscribing, the algorithm begins deciding whether to show you the next one. It does not always decide in your favor. Practical zone-specific content goes out from this channel every single week. Content that stops you from spending another spring replacing plants that were never going to survive. Hit subscribe. It won't take you many seconds as it took you to read that sentence. Vegetable number 7 is the carrot, and this one solves one of the most frustrating problems in American gardens, which is soil. Rocky, compacted, or heavy clay soil twists and forks carrot roots into stubby, misshapen vegetables no matter how carefully they're planted. A container filled with loose potting mix removes that obstacle completely, giving carrots the soft, unobstructed path they need to grow straight and long. A 12-inch deep container is ideal for most varieties, though short, round types can succeed in shallower pots, which matters a great deal for anyone whose backyard is nothing but hard clay that a shovel barely dents. Use a fine, stone-free potting mix, specifically to avoid forking. Water consistently and gently, since heavy watering can wash tiny seeds away before germination. Carrots need 6 or more hours of sun. A light phosphorus-focused feed midway through growth supports root development. Carrots and onions planted together can help confuse pests that target either crop. The common mistake is using regular garden soil instead of a fine, loose mix, which defeats the entire purpose of container growing and leads right back to the same forked, stubby roots the container was meant to prevent. Harvest typically arrives in 60 to 80 days, and round varieties like Paris Market or Thumbelina are especially well suited to containers with limited depth. Most gardeners never expect this next one to make the list at all. Vegetable number 8 is zucchini and summer squash, a crop notorious for attracting the squash vine borer when planted directly in garden soil where the pest overwinters. Containers filled with fresh, sterile potting mix interrupt that life cycle, and elevated, isolated plantings are simply harder for ground-dwelling pests to locate and infest in the first place. A 10-gallon container is the minimum for a single plant, since squash roots and foliage both need generous room to spread without competing against themselves for water and nutrients. Use a rich mix loaded with compost, and water deeply and frequently, since squash are thirsty, fast-growing plants that can wilt dramatically on a hot afternoon if the soil dries out even slightly. Full sun of 6 to 8 hours is essential. Feed every 2 weeks with a balanced fertilizer once fruiting begins. Radishes planted at the base can act as a trap crop, drawing pests away from the squash itself. The common mistake is underestimating how large squash plants become and crowding them into pots meant for smaller crops. Harvest begins around 50 days from planting, and compact varieties like Astia or Patio Star are bred specifically for container success, delivering the same buttery squash without the sprawling 6-foot-wide plant taking over an entire garden bed. This next vegetable thrives on something most gardeners assume it hates. Vegetable number 9 is eggplant, a true heat lover that struggles in cool, slow-to-warm garden soil during a short growing season. A dark container heats up quickly in the sun, giving eggplant roots the elevated warmth they need far earlier in the season than ground soil typically provides, which translates into earlier flowering and glossier, more abundant fruit. A 5-gallon dark-colored container works well. Use a rich, well-draining mix and water consistently, allowing the top inch to dry between waterings. Eggplant needs full sun, 6 to 8 hours minimum. Feed every 2 to 3 weeks with a balanced fertilizer, switching to a phosphorus-rich blend once flowering starts. Beans planted nearby can help improve surrounding soil nitrogen. The common mistake is planting too early in cold soil, which stunts the plant permanently, even if temperatures later improve, since eggplant rarely recovers from an early cold shock the way tomatoes sometimes can. Harvest arrives around 70 to 85 days, and compact varieties like Fairy Tale or Patio Baby are ideal for smaller containers, producing glossy purple fruit that looks just as striking on a patio as it does on a dinner plate. And now, the vegetable that surprises even experienced gardeners more than anything else on this entire list. Vegetable number 10 is the radish, and nothing else comes close to how fast it performs in a container. Ground-planted radishes often compete with weeds and uneven soil moisture that slow growth and toughen texture. In a container, moisture stays even, competition disappears entirely, and radishes race through their growth cycle faster than almost any other vegetable grown at home. A 6-inch deep container is all that's needed. Use a light, loose potting mix and keep it consistently moist, since inconsistent watering causes radishes to turn woody and sharp-tasting instead of that crisp, peppery bite they're supposed to have. 4 to 6 hours of sun is sufficient. Fertilizer is barely necessary, beyond what's already in a quality potting mix, since heavy feeding produces more leaf than root. Radishes pair beautifully with carrots, marking rows and breaking up soil as they mature quickly and get pulled early, leaving loosened soil behind for the slower-growing crop beside them. The common mistake is leaving radishes in the ground too long once mature, which causes them to split and turn bitter almost overnight. Harvest arrives in just 22 to 30 days, making radishes the fastest, most beginner-friendly container vegetable on this entire list, perfect for anyone who wants proof that a container garden works before committing to anything slower. Varieties like Cherry Belle and French Breakfast are reliable, fast, and endlessly satisfying to pull from a pot on a patio. That covers all 10, and the pattern running through every single one of them is impossible to ignore. Container gardening is no longer just the backup plan for people without a yard. For tomatoes fighting soil-borne disease, for peppers craving extra heat, for potatoes needing clean, easy harvests, for greens competing against weeds, and for every other vegetable on this list, containers are genuinely the smarter growing method, not a smaller version of a real garden. Fewer weeds pulling nutrients away, better drainage keeping roots healthy, stronger control over exactly what soil a plant sits in, and airflow that keeps disease from spreading from leaf to leaf, all add up to the same conclusion again and again throughout this video. For a huge range of common vegetables, a pot on a patio can genuinely outproduce a traditional row planted straight into the ground. If just one container gets started this season because of this video, that alone proves the point better than any explanation could. Start small, pick one vegetable that solves a real problem, whether that's bad soil, limited space, or simply wanting fresher food within arm's reach of the kitchen door, and build from there. Which one would you grow first? Have you ever had better success growing vegetables in containers than in the ground? What vegetable on this list surprised you the most, and what container vegetable has given you your biggest harvest so far? Drop it in the comments, because it always helps other gardeners scrolling through to see what's actually working in real yards and on real patios. If nothing else, pick just one vegetable from this list and try it in a container this season, even if only to see the difference firsthand. If today's video changed how you think about container gardening, the next video needs to be next on your list, because it reveals the vegetables almost every gardener plants at exactly the wrong time, and how shifting that planting window by just a few weeks can dramatically increase what ends up on the harvest table.